Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition. Anya, I was just reading a fascinating piece that argues our entire modern idea of free speech is, well, based on a cognitive misunderstanding.
Oh, that's quite a claim. You mean legally or socially?
Cognitively. The argument is that we treat free speech like it's this passive right, kind of like breathing, when it's actually an active, incredibly demanding cognitive skill that you have to develop.
Like learning to play the piano? You've got the potential, sure, but you're not a virtuoso from day one.
I'm hooked. Let's get into it.
So when you hear the phrase freedom of speech, what comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's this image, right? An open tap, just a pure, unrestricted flow of thoughts into the world. It's a powerful idea. But is that really freedom? Or is it just unfiltered noise? See, from a cognitive standpoint, true freedom might just be the complete opposite of this kind of impulsive, uncontrolled output.
So here we've got two totally different ways of looking at communication. On the left, you've got speech as this uncontrolled explosion of thought, a model that, let's be honest, when millions of people do it, doesn't really create a marketplace of ideas. It just creates a deafening wall of sound. But on the right, we have a more powerful and frankly, a much harder idea. Speech as a cultivated, deliberate act. And that's the idea we're going to explore today. This really brings us to a radical way of reframing the whole thing. We're often taught that freedom means no limits, a kind of personal anarchy. But what if the highest form of cognitive freedom isn't the ability to act on every single impulse you have, but the developed power, the actual strength to choose not to? Look, anyone can speak. It's a basic biological function. But real freedom, that shows up in that critical pause. That little fraction of a second between the impulse and the action. The moment you feel that urge to say something, but you assess its potential impact and you consciously decide to hold it back for a greater purpose. That isn't being weak or censoring yourself. That is your executive function at its absolute peak. Let's make this real. Imagine you're visiting a sick friend. The raw data coming in through your eyes might be, wow, you look awful. Now, honesty without wisdom is just, well, it's just a data dump. The cognitively mature thing to do is to calculate the impact of those words. Choosing to say something encouraging instead isn't a lie, it's a strategic pro-social action. You're using your freedom to build a connection, not just a state of fact that's going to break it.
So how does the brain even make that split-second call between what's helpful and what's harmful? Well, it seems to run on a core principle, a kind of internal algorithm we can call the principle of utility. Before speaking, the mature mind instinctively asks a really simple but profound question. What's the point of saying this? In some philosophical traditions, they have a specific word for this, theta. It's a fantastic concept. It means more than just utility. It means constructive utility. This way of thinking frames speech not as some thought that just accidentally escapes your mouth, but as a deliberate action you perform in the world. And just like any other action, it should be calculated to create a net benefit for you or for the group. We can actually break this process down into three cognitive steps. First, there's the impulse, that raw thought, that emotional flash. That's automatic. It comes from your limbic system. But then comes the uniquely human part, the calculation. This is your prefrontal cortex, the CEO of your brain, weighing the consequences and the utility. And only after that crucial step do you get to a conscious action, to speak or, just as powerfully, to stay silent. And this, right here, is the core idea. A thought that's just in your head is nothing more than neural activity. It's powerless. But the second you speak it, it becomes an action with real-world consequences. It literally changes the chemistry in the room. Real freedom means taking ownership of those consequences before you act.
Now, it is absolutely crucial that we distinguish this internal self-regulation from its complete opposite, external control or censorship. One is an act of personal power, of agency. The other is the removal of it. Cognitively speaking, they are worlds apart.
The mental faculty we're talking about here has been called Irade, which is a specific kind of cognitive willpower. Don't think of it as brute force, like making yourself do something you don't want to do. Think of it as the finely tuned mastery of choosing not to act on an impulse. It is the very engine of self-regulation. It's the muscle that creates that all-important pause.
And the difference is just, it's stark. Censorship comes from the outside. It's imposed on you by some authority, and it leads to this resentful, forced silence. But this cognitive willpower is internal, it's self-directed, and it leads to purposeful, disciplined communication. One is a cage, the other is the skill to fly.
Of course, this doesn't mean all external limits on speech are wrong. A mature society can and absolutely does agree to restrict speech that causes scientifically provable harm. I mean, think about the consensus around protecting children from certain kinds of content. But the key here is that this is based on a shared, rational understanding of harm, not on arbitrary power. The goal is to shield, not just to silence.
Okay, so what happens when an entire society loses this internal skill? When millions of people just default to that unfiltered output, believing it's their sacred right? Well, you don't get a vibrant marketplace of ideas. You get something far, far more dangerous.
You get cacophony, a relentless, overwhelming, and ultimately meaningless storm of noise. It's the illusion of communication. Everyone is broadcasting, but almost no one is tuning in. In a state like this, the goal isn't to be understood anymore. It's just to be heard over the noise, to make the loudest sound.
In a state of cacophony, even criticism turns toxic. It stops being a tool to make things better and just becomes a weapon for social aggression. I mean, pointing out a flaw without offering any kind of path forward isn't critique, it's just an attack. And a society that can't tell the difference between the two anymore, that society is in deep trouble.
And this is the ultimate price we pay. When the signal is completely drowned out by noise, the very institutions we rely on for shared truth, science, academia, expert journalism, they lose their authority. And it's not because of some grand conspiracy, it's because of a collective cognitive breakdown. The public loses the ability to listen. The whole societal compass just shatters, and every direction starts to seem equally meaningless. So the only way out of that downward spiral is to fundamentally shift how we see this. We have to stop treating meaningful speech like it's this automatic right that everyone just has, and start treating it for what it is, a difficult, cultivated skill that requires immense and continuous effort.
You know, there's this ancient proverb that says it all perfectly. Before you speak, you have total control. You can shape the thought, you can refine it, test it out, or just throw it away entirely. It is your servant. But once that word is out in the world, you have zero control. It becomes its own thing, and you are forever tied to its consequences. That split second of control, that moment of choice, that's where the real work of this skill happens.
And so let's end by turning this lens from the societal back to the personal. Because this isn't just about abstract forces, it's about the millions of tiny cognitive choices that each of us makes every single day. Our words are tools. They're tools of creation. They can build trust and understanding and progress, or they can break all of those things. The choice requires skill, requires effort, and it requires willpower. So the question is, what will you build?